Welcome to another Bible prophecy video with Pastor Tom Elseroad. Have your Bibles ready as we dig deeper into God's holy word.
So let me open up in a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for the rain. Just thank you for loving us. And we just pray you be with us today as we look at your word and in our conversation be one that honors you. In Jesus' name, amen. So my plan and intent was to do things a little less like me talking and you listening. In other words, get you guys involved. So asking questions is always a good thing. I wasn't looking at doing the sacrifices today. We did that a while back when we were still teaching upstairs. We did talk about the millennial kingdom and what was going on, and that when we had looked at all of the passages that deal with that. But today I want to start slowly going through, because one of the passages that got my attention more than anything was going through Matthew's, Jesus' dialogue on the Mount of Olives concerning the future and what's going to happen. And so the reason it's significant was it was the first passage that really made me think, now why am I a pre-trib anymore? After I go through the text, I realized from this very passage, and there's others now that more than confirm it, especially 2 Thessalonians 2. But Matthew does such an awesome job, Jesus describing what's going to happen in the future. So my intention is, I don't know that I'm going to put together an audio. I am recording, but I don't know that we'll necessarily do that because we have a lot of interaction, which is what I hope for, some interaction and asking questions. Then I don't want to put that necessarily online. When I do the teaching dialogue, and that's easy to put together video and all that, and audio and all that. But if we go through this slowly and I want to go through it in such a way that by the time you get done, I hope you're really comfortable with what Jesus says here in Matthew 24, because I think it's critical for us to understand what's going to happen in the future. So the Olivet Discourse isn't just chapter 24, it's also chapter 25. So we're going to do 24 and 25. It's going to take quite a while, I think, to get through it. And so, again, I don't plan on going in a hurry. I want us to be able to think about it and analyze it. So I'm just going to start with verse 1, right out of the chute. Now, there's more background things that we could talk about, and we had done one where we talked about the temple and where it's located. And that'd be a good prerequisite also, but at this point, unless there's people want to see more of it, I don't believe that what we call the Temple Mount today is the Temple Mount. That was more like the Roman garrison would have been up there on that 36-acre lot, and then they were in the temple would have been in the city of David, and so we're dealing with that to the south of the city. But hardly any. There's a few that are out there that get that, but it doesn't matter dramatically, does it? Because when we looked at what happened last week in Zechariah, we know that all gets broken up anyway. Jesus steps on the Mount of Olives and there's a big separation and things are going to change in a dramatic way there. So it's not critical to know where it all was located at that time. Because people have a tendency to think, and it may be true, that where this temple was before is where it's going to be in the future. Maybe. But I don't know it's critical that it has to be exact in the same location. But let me just go ahead and get started here. Matthew 24, verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. So why is he showing, why are they wanting to show Jesus the temple? They're pretty impressed with the buildings. They're like, aren't these beautiful buildings, Jesus? Right? So they're trying to encourage him, because if you go back to chapter 23, which is kind of the really disappointing, depressing kind of a chapter where Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and over the leadership. And it says, Jesus went out of it and departed from the temple, because he was in the temple, and his conversation with them did not go very well, to say the least. There's the cleansing of the temple and all that went with it. So everything about Jesus and in relation to the leaders, and especially the religious leaders in Jerusalem, were pretty, there's a big thick wall there. They were very separated. They didn't get along very well at all. So that's kind of the background. And there's a little bit more to it, because it's also in that same context is the idea of the Jesus saw an olive tree, and he said, "May no fruit come from you." And then the next day they see it and it's completely withered. It's a picture of what Jesus is saying prophetically about the nation of Israel. The olive tree is a picture of Israel, and he said no fruit comes from it. And the next day they all go, "Wait a minute, wasn't that kind of like it had a lot of leaves yesterday but no fruit on it, and now it's withered," right? And so it was a picture of what Jesus already knows is inevitable. They're going to reject him. Israel's going to reject him, and they're going to crucify him and all that. And that's kind of a picture of what happens to Israel, because since Jesus got crucified, even to today, though they are in the land, they're still in unbelief. They are very unfruitful, spiritually speaking. So that's kind of, there's a lot more detail to that leading up to it, but get you the idea there's tension there between Jesus and the religious leaders. So he went out of the temple, departed, and his disciples came up to him and showed him the buildings of the temple, because again, they're impressed with it. To me, doesn't it sound like they're kind of oblivious to, wait a minute, there's a big problem here between me and the religious leaders, and you're like, boy, isn't this a wonderful building? It's kind of like, wait a minute, they're happy, and they're kind of like maybe trying to cheer them up or something, whatever the motivation is. It's kind of like they seem to be, maybe they sense the tensions there because they had to know it, but the question seems kind of off color based on the context and the intensity of the relationship between Jesus and the people there. So the disciples wanted to discuss how beautiful, the temple was. Isn't it aren't these great places? Look at it. Wow, it's so awesome. Yeah, that's true, but there's a lot more to it that Jesus is concerned with. The disciples, several of whom were rural fishermen from Galilee, were quite amazed at the majesty of the temple, right? They're just amazed by it, isn't it all? So again, I think their intention is to encourage Jesus as if he needs to be encouraged. He knew full well what was going to happen. That's why the event with the fig tree that just occurred before this chapter was important, because it shows he's demonstrating his understanding that they're going to reject him. No surprise to Jesus. Jesus was more concerned with the hearts of the people than with the beauty of the buildings. I think that's pretty obvious. He's not worried about or concerned with any of the external things. He cares what's going on inside of us. So I want you to get that vision. They kind of start out, they ask a question, and Jesus is going to kind of blow them away with his answer. So Herod's temple is what we often call the second temple. We were describing Ezra and Nehemiah would be what is the second temple. You have Solomon's temple. It gets destroyed 586 BC and all that. And they get scattered to Babylon. And then they eventually come back. And then they begin to build a second temple. And it was a lot smaller. And the old men weep while the young men rejoiced and all that. We go through some of the prophets that talk about that and how they were discouraged because they knew that Solomon's temple was much larger. This is much smaller. But the reason this is called Herod's temple, the second one, is because they built so much, and then Herod, a Roman, gets involved, and he starts expanding the buildings, making it larger, making it nicer, trying to placate to the people, say, you're in charge here, and I'm going to try to do some things to make you happy, so you don't make my life miserable, you make my life good, and I can be a good leader. His intentions were to try to smooth things over. And Israelites don't tend to be very good about being subjugated. So Herod the Great began this temple in 20 BC. It was still under construction, by the way, after his death to the time of the destruction of that temple. So he never really finished it. But from 20 BC, they started working on it. By the time Jesus comes on the scene, it's a lot larger, and it's a pretty elaborate. So that, again, the disciples are looking at it going, isn't this pretty cool? This is awesome. Knowing Romans actually built that for them. But the bottom line is Herod's just trying to do things to try to make it easy for himself. At the time of Jesus' ministry, the temple was one of the most impressive structures in the world, made of massive blocks of stone and covered in places with ornate gold. So it had a value that was pretty amazing with the gold. And some of the stones of the temple complex measure 40 by 12 by 12 feet. I mean, some of them are pretty big, and they just cut just right. So, boom, you place them in there, and they're not going anywhere. It's a great foundation. So they're impressed with the buildings. Jesus is more impressed with what's going on in their heart and what's not going on in their heart. And then verse 2. Then Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? And he's referring to the what? To the temple, all these buildings and all that goes on there. Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. That's pretty straightforward language. All these beautiful stones, large and small, he's saying every single one of them is going to be overthrown. And, they're impressed with the building, and Jesus is saying, but it's all going away. You can see how this is going to bring up a lot of questions in the minds of the disciples. They're like, say, what? You got to be kidding. That's not really going to happen, is it? That would be devastating for them in their thinking. So the temple was the center of Jewish life. Even in the feast, even in the future, they made back then, in the Old Testament, they had 3 of the 7 feasts. They had to actually come to Jerusalem in around the idea of the temple to do worship, right? 3 times a year. And there were 7 of these feasts altogether. In the future, it describes the Feast of Tabernacles, that they will come once a year, but that's from all over the world. That would be in Gentile nations, and they're all kind of, bottom line is they're coming into worship also in the future. So the temple is the center of everything for Israel, right? So to say every stone would be thrown down as was the destruction, would be the destruction of Judaism. I mean, think about it. Your whole culture, your whole society is built around that, and it is going to be torn down. You can imagine that's more than a big thing. That's devastating beyond their understanding. I guess when you think about it from the standpoint of when they go into captivity in Babylon and all that, they always had this dream of going back and building the temple and getting it all back together. But Jesus is saying, but that's all going to be completely torn apart and taken down. Devastating. They can't even think in those terms. So this would be like God saying that God's favor is no longer on the Jewish people. And some people say, well, you think? Of course, that's exactly what it means. That's why the image of the fig tree just before this chapter is a picture of they're going to be in a nation without producing any fruit for a long period of time. So at least since, well, I'll say 70 AD, but it really goes back to Jesus' time, till the day they are still a nation and they're not spiritually producing any fruit. And Jesus is concerned with the spiritual fruit, not literal fruit on the tree, right? So did Jesus really mean not one stone would be left upon another? What do you think? Don't read the word. Don't read. Yes, and some people say, oh, he didn't really mean that. It's hyperbolic. He's really just saying, because the Jews pray to the western wall, and they think that's one of the walls of the temple. At least that's how they describe it, even though you can orient yourself and go, well, no, that's a wall. That wasn't a temple building, but on the west side of the city, they pray at the Wailing Wall and all that. And the idea is that's the western wall of the temple. Obviously, it's not. The problem with that is it's a wall, and it's bricks one upon another. Jesus says, no, that's not going to be true for the temple. Every single stone will be removed. That's just a portion of the city that they're praying to, a wall. It's more ironic when you think about it. Probably was the place where the Roman garrisons were located on the top at the high level. So anyway, 70 AD temple event. Now we're going to build up to a little bit because Jesus is going to describe something here that he's not going to describe 70 AD in Matthew, but he will in Luke. And only in Luke does he talk about the 70 AD event. Everything Jesus talks about in Matthew is going to be in the future, and only in the future. So that's important to get that. Only in Luke does it describe the event. But Jesus does talk about both. Jesus talks about the 70 AD event that's going to happen, where the temple is going to be destroyed and all that. to great detail, and the persecution and the killings and all that goes with it. But when you get to Matthew, it's all just simply out in the future. So I just want you to know that Luke is the one that really will describe more of this, the destruction. Jesus does say it, now one stone will be left upon another. It's referring to the 70 AD event. That's as far as Matthew takes it, as far as the details of the temple being destroyed, is that it's going to be destroyed. They just don't know when. So years later, in about 63 AD, the Jews built sort of a peasant army, right? They're thinking, we got to do something to get rid of these Romans. Just try to imagine what that would be like, as Rome is strong and powerful, and they got a strong force and all that. They want to overthrow the Romans. When the temple was thrown down in 70 AD, the Romans hired the Arabs. We talked about there's a lot of history that they didn't have Italians, Romans coming in and destroying it. They hired people from the region to come in and destroy the temple. It was the Arabs mostly who literally separated every stone to get to the melted gold. Remember we talked about the stones, and in certain places but you also know the temple was also a storehouse. They had a treasury in the temple, so there was a lot of gold and silver, precious metals and stones and all that would have been there in that region. So if you burned that, you got a lot of precious stuff that are being destroyed. So, and Josephus is the one who talks about this in his Jewish Wars, about the gold and the melting of the gold. And Josephus is a Jewish historian, historian who also was captured himself, but he still writes the events that went on. So there's so much gold retrieved at a time. He said that the gold lost some of its value. I mean, because it was taken everywhere, and everybody all of a sudden for a small period of time had a lot of gold on hand that normally don't have gold. People that would take it home with them to the family, and anyway, got the idea that when the temple was destroyed, part of the reason all the stones were torn apart, stone by stone, was because of this. Apparently, the gold they got involved in melting, and they're just breaking the rocks. They're doing anything they can to get to the gold. They're not about destroying the temple. At that point, they're about trying to get rich. They're trying to find the precious gold. So in here, the Jerusalem buildup is pretty important because, before the 70 AD event, before the destruction of the temple, there's kind of like three, in my mind, I break it down into three little sections that go on. So it starts back in 64 AD. Everybody probably remembers that there was this nice guy in Rome called Nero. I'm being sarcastic, okay? And he had started a fire, and he blamed it on the Christians, and so he needed a scapegoat, somebody to blame it on, and so the Christians were the ones that were blamed. So Nero in 64 AD blames the Christians, so that begins a persecution. Remember, up to this point, almost all persecution, you go through the book of Acts, is from the Jews against the Christians. In fact, Paul also was a Roman citizen as likewise, so he took advantage of the Jewish, the Roman laws, took advantage of their rules and all that for his protection. So the Romans were not very harsh on the Christians at all. The only ones that were harsh would have been the Jews. The Jews would have been the ones that caused almost all the persecution. But when Nero changed things a little bit, when he blamed the Christians, the things changed now. Now Rome is now against the Christians. They were kind of indifferent. They just saw Christianity as nothing but another Jewish sect. And it was an official religion, right? A Jewish sect would be Judaism. So they had no problem with that. And the Christianity was just another Jewish sect. They didn't think much about it, and things changed at this time. So 64 AD became a big time because that's when the government of Rome became a persecutor. So I know it's a little small. This would probably be good maybe as a handout. So the Jews rebelled against Roman rule. We know that. We saw that. That's part of the reasons that God was the reason why Jesus was crucified. The whole thing was planned. But humanly speaking, the Jews wanted nothing to do with Rome, and they wanted to do everything they could to get rid of Rome. And they were okay with Jesus if he was going to get rid of Rome, and Jesus didn't come to get rid of Rome, right? So that's a big deal. So the Roman army commander, Cestus Gallus, came came to put the Jewish rebellion down. They came to, you guys are uprising, you guys are such a pain, we're going to try to stop you from what you're doing. So after surrounding Jerusalem, so there was a siege, so the little twirly things mean whenever they had surrounded Jerusalem. They had done this back in 66. So they surrounded the troops, the city. The Jews pursued what happened is, for whatever reason, they got the city surrounded, and he said, I think we're not doing this. Doesn't sound like a good idea if you're a Roman, you were told to do this, and then you stop doing this. So now you're going to get yourself in trouble. So they left, they started to leave after surrounding the city, and as they were leaving, as the Romans were leaving, the Jews pursued the Romans, and they slew 5,300 footmen, right? The soldiers were killed, 380 horsemen, and the Jews only lost a couple of men out of the whole deal. So from the Jewish standpoint, boy, look at what we just did. Now, the only reason they were able to do that is because the Romans were not on offense, they were on defense, they were retreating. And they took advantage of them and captured, destroyed many of them, killed many of them. So this withdrawal by the Romans gave the Jews a sense of they're unconquerable. God's on our side. We can win. We can get rid of these Romans. Now they're more emboldened, are they not? They're really thinking they can do that. So that's back there, 64 and 66. That was siege 1. In 67, 68, a few more things take place. So news of Rome's defeat at the hand of the Jews reached Nero, right? This is early on. He was upset with the general, as you can imagine. Anyway, not a good plan to disobey. So Nero ordered Vespasian. Vespasian is a general, right? To go back down to Jerusalem and crush that uprising. I already sent one down there to do it. He failed. Now I want you to go down and do that. He wants you to go to Jerusalem and take care of this uprising of the Jews. Vespasian advanced on Galilee, north, and then conquered some cities, and he ended up around the city, and he did surround them as he was supposed to. He conquered many major cities along the way. So he marched south and encamped around Jerusalem up to 68 AD. And what happened in 68 AD was somebody named Nero kicked the bucket, right? He died. He was a bad guy, but long story short, there's a lot of history as to how and why, but he died. He's no longer alive. He's the emperor, and the emperor is dead, right, at this time. So news of Nero's death came back to Rome, caused Vespasian to delay his attack on Jerusalem. So this is the second time they've now surrounded Jerusalem and have not overtaken it. So again, remember that from the Jewish standpoint, we're doing pretty good. Everything's working to our advantage. So Vespasian, also left. They didn't have the same kind of result. The Jews didn't go after them. He withdrew his troops and returned to Rome, where he became emperor. He had a new motivation. Why did he stop worrying about what was going on in Jerusalem? Because I'm about to become emperor if I get up there. And he did. He went back to Rome, and he became the emperor of Rome. Big deal. You see his motivation. And so, again, it appeared the Jews prevailed. See, each time they're getting more confident, right? Wow, these Romans can't do anything against us. They're wrong, but you get the idea. So that's that. Then the third part was actually 70 AD. So Vespasian is now the emperor. Before Passover, Titus, the son of Vespasian, arrived at Jerusalem. So now Vespasian is sending his son, Titus, who is also general now, he had to go in and take care of this problem in Jerusalem. So for the third time, you see the siege, the little warrior symbol there, the idea to cover and surround Israel, right? Or I should say Jerusalem. So the Romans encircled and built an embankment around the city, as Jesus foretold in Luke 19. Luke 19, and I have 43 and 44, and then in Luke 21, where the rest of the Olivet Discourse gives more details. Luke is interesting the way it presents information. Like, for example, in Matthew, it's dealing with 24, 25. It's pretty much everything Jesus said other than a few details about the Olivet Discourse. It's all together. Luke brings it up in pieces. as the Spirit gave him remembrance. I'm going to John, when in the Gospel of John, where it says, as the Spirit will give you, bring back to your remembrance things that he told you. So it seems like there are places in Luke where it's the Olivet Discourse teaching, but it's not all together in one big chapter. Just put that in perspective. Matthew does teach it all together, but Luke seems to disperse it throughout a couple places near the end of the book, but not like all over the place, but near the end, but not all in one place. I think that's important. Those who sought to flee Jerusalem were prevented from the inside by the Jewish factions. They say, no, you're not leaving. You're not going to get away. They don't want the Jews to leave. They don't want each other to leave, your friends to leave. And from the outside, they were captured, tortured, and crucified by the Romans by the city wall so everybody could see them. If you tried to get away and the Romans caught you, you went through a terrible death, right, in front of everybody. And it was designed to bring fear on the Jews. And when you see your friends or whatever out there dying like that, it's a terrible thing. So the temple burned August 10th. This is basically the same month that the first temple burned. Solomon's temple was destroyed. It was also destroyed in August. But, a number of years ago, 500 years ago, almost 600 years ago, by that time, right? So the point is, both of the times the temples were destroyed was in August. Doesn't mean anything, I don't think, anymore. So Josephus, the Jewish historian, records 97,000 Jews were taken captive, including himself, but 1.1 million were killed. A lot of people were killed. Now, when I say overran, they came in eventually into the city, destroyed the city, the walls, and especially what Jesus said, what was going to be destroyed? The temple with not one stone left upon another. That's a pretty big deal, and that's that had gone on. And then I put as a second little thing, the Jews were still defiant, if you will. And so in 70 AD, the little garrison atop Mount Masada take place. Many of you have probably seen the movie or the show and series they had on Masada, where they're on top of this, what was a Roman-built fortress, and the Jews are inside there, and they're like, no, we're not giving up. And eventually, of course, they ended up dying, long story short. So, but they were still rebellious against them and all that. I got to keep it moving. I haven't moved it for a while. I saw it changing. So a couple of details I think are worth background to this. So the Olivet Discourse in Matthew. Matthew does not record the 32 through 72 persecution of the Olivet Discourse. Again, only Luke does, and that's important. So Matthew's only going to be talking about things that happen in the future, other than where he says not one stone would be left upon another. That part is 70 AD. After that, he doesn't describe any other details of it. Only Luke will. So this refers to the time period prior to 70 AD, right, before the destruction of the temple, because after 70 AD, the Jews had authority to haul Paul, religious people, to the synagogues. It seemed like the point is things are changing between 32 and 70 AD, where it was all the persecution came from the Jews, and then by 64, again, now the major persecution wasn't the Jews so much. The Jews were really more focused on getting rid of Rome, and Rome became the big persecutor of the church. You don't really see that in the book of Acts. You don't see Rome as a problem. Because by the time Acts was written, I'm trying to remember the exact date, by the time it finished, was around the time of Nero, but it doesn't include you don't really see persecution from Rome. Now we hear in church history, in other words, we hear the Colosseum and all that. That would have been the beginning of things that would have been involved with Nero, that kind of persecution. But again, that was not a big deal. You don't see that in Scripture, right? Because it only deals with the Jewish persecution on believers. So in Matthew 10:23, Jesus takes the persecution of the Christians and the gospel proclamation beyond the immediate time frame and applies it to the church age. I want you to get building how important Matthew 24 and 25 really are for the church. This is very significant for the church. Some would have some deny that it's for the church. Because we'll look at that verse a little bit later on. He said, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And we'll look at that over in Luke in a little bit here. The idea is he's telling you there's going to be a number of events that's going to take place. I'm summarizing until we get to the details, right? This confirms the idea that there's no interruption of the historical progress of the church until Jesus returns in the day of the Lord. So Jesus is going to describe a bunch of things that's going to go on that's just going to go on and on and on. And I'm going to use the word delay. There's going to be a long delay before Jesus comes. That clearly is what Jesus says when you get to Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse. He's talking about all these different things. When you see all these things, that's still not the end. And then he's saying that's just the beginning. Jesus is more than implying it's going to be a long delay before he comes. That's important because there's some people think the idea of Jesus coming was imminent, and it never was imminent. A number of things had to take place. A couple more details. I'm just trying to build a little bit of theology before we dive further, into the text. So Luke 21 is where he talked about that. But before all these things, he keeps telling you more and more things are going to happen before he comes, right? They will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. For my name's sake. So think about that. Who could that possibly be referring to? When someone said they're going to be persecuted for the name of Jesus, who would that refer to? I would think that would be Christians, right? Believers. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's going to be Jews, because Jews don't believe in Jesus still. And so that's obviously, for my name's sake, we're saying Christians are going to be the ones that are going to be persecuted. By saying, as he opened up that verse there, by saying before all these things, Jesus is placing the following information before the larger scale events. You see false prophets and famines and earthquakes, and he's going to get that in just a couple of verses from here. But he's saying before all that, there's more of this persecution going to go on, is what he's pointing to. Although Matthew and Mark record this question, when will these things be? As Jesus said in Matthew, because he's about to say that in verse 3 here, coming up. In response to the statement of Jesus that the temple would be destroyed, neither writer actually records the answer as Luke does. Only Luke answers the first question as we get to the next verse in Matthew. They're going to ask, the disciples ask questions, 3 questions. One, like the second and third, a lot of times people combine together because they're kind of referring to the same idea, same event. But 3 questions they're going to ask, and the first one is concerning the destruction of the temple. Only in Luke does it answer it. Matthew and Mark record the question, but you're going to see in the text he doesn't really answer in Matthew the question of, well, when's the temple going to be destroyed and all that. Only in Luke does it do that. So I think that's an important concept. So sometimes I like to visually draw things out in my mind and look at how things are going to happen. So I kind of put this together. So you're going to have, you got Israel and the church between 32 AD and 70 AD. What's the focus? Well, you say it's on the church because 32 AD is what? Pentecost and the birth of the church, and Pentecost is one of the 7 feasts, right? And so you got the birth of the church in 32 AD, but yet at the same time, you got Israel, which I show as orange, and that light blue is the church. It's going on at the same time. One of the concepts as a pre-tribber and in the past is that you say God's only dealing with one person at a time. It's a false idea. I think we're going to show that as time goes on. But the idea is God deals with Israel or the church and one at a time. But from 32 AD to 70 AD, clearly God's dealing with Israel while the church is growing, while the church is maturing and spreading and all that. They're still going on at the same time. And again, really between that time, most of the persecution of the church was coming from the Jews, right? And that's important. So the church age began in 32 AD until the rapture of the church, right? I mean, we start in 32 AD on the day of Pentecost, and when we go up to be with Christ, that whole time is this blue period which is, of course, the church. The church is focused there. That doesn't mean that God's not going to and cannot deal with two groups at the same time. Even Paul, when he's describing in Romans how the idea that he's making Israel jealous by bringing all these blessings to this Gentile group of people called the church. And ultimately the idea is that our blessing should make them jealous for wanting to be God's people again. The idea is that they should come through faith, is what Paul describes in Romans. There's so many things that talk about how they have to be going on at the same time. God's dealing with both. He's dealing with their heart by seeing what's going on in the church. Even today, God's still dealing with Israel. It's hard to imagine that he's not. How did he brought them back to the land, right? He brought them back to the land in unbelief, right? They don't believe in Jesus, but God's working on Israel while the church still exists. We're not taken out until the rapture. These are important concepts because it kind of works against the idea of the pre-trib idea that God deals with one group at a time and only one group at a time. He's got to get rid of, they say you got to get rid of the church has to be raptured so God can deal with Israel again. Well, it's so false. He's dealing with the church in Israel even today, and as he had back then. So I think that's pretty amazing. So during this period, the mystery of lawlessness is at work, what Paul says, but it's under a restraint by a restrainer. And of course that ends up being the whole idea of Michael gets involved with it. We looked at that to some detail. But the point is we're still in existence while the Israel is still in existence. And God's doing different things to both groups. Anyway, this period is characterized by the advance of false teaching. Next verse, when we get into Matthew, he's going to start emphasizing these things, right? The false teaching that's going to go on, and general hatred and persecution of God's people. That's going on for a long period of time since, again, when the church was born. At first, there was obviously a lot of growth, and because most of the churches were somewhat near Jerusalem in Israel, the persecution from Jews would be predominant. So anyway, I just want you to see this concept that is that Israel and the church are going on at the same time. In the future, God's going to be dealing with that last 7-year period of time. The church and Israel will still be in existence, and God will still be working on both of those groups at the same time. And I think that's important. Now, verse 3 says, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be?'" Now that's the question that's only answered in Luke, the first question. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what are those things? Well, he just told you the temple is going to be destroyed and not one stone will be left upon another. That's all that he's referring to, right? When will these things be? Will not be answered in Matthew, but only in Luke. They said, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Some people kind of combine those two like it's one long question. It is, but actually the sign of his coming and the end of the age are really two events, maybe a day or two apart, but or within a day, but they're two events that happen at the same time. So you can kind of see how that people like to combine the second as the sign of your coming and the end of the age is kind of one thing. So when will these things be? He answers that in Luke and only in Luke. And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, he will answer in Matthew, where we are here. So the disciples probably thought the temple being destroyed would be the end of the world. You got to imagine how devastating that would be for them, because it's the whole world evolves around what goes on in the context of the temple. And they come into the Jerusalem, the Jews from around the outside of Israel will come to Israel to worship, and all that's going to come to an end. Just for example, they likely did not receive an extended period of time. And this is where some of you probably have heard of the preterists. The preterists are those that believe that basically, we hold a sign up saying, the end is near. They crossed that out. And they said, the end is past, meaning it's already happened. The preterists believe that it's something, the coming to Jesus already happened in 70 AD, from their view. I'm just going to give you how they view it. And they're pretty adamant about it. And they use little hint phrases from different verses. It just doesn't fit the bigger picture. They have to ignore all the plans that God has for Israel and all that, but we won't go into detail of that. But it gets you the idea. Some people think that everything we're saying is going to happen in the future, they say it's happened in the past to some extent. So some would swear by the temple because they thought it would never go away. We swear, I know we probably shouldn't have done this as kids, but I did as an unbeliever. I swear to God, I'm telling the truth this time. Right? Because it wasn't what I was normally doing. And when I say I swear to God, it means I'm really doing it. Well, they took the temple because nothing could ever happen to the temple. So if you swear against the temple, then you're saying it's really true. Because we know nothing will ever happen to the temple. But wait, Jesus just said something will. So I just want you to get a feel for how devastating it would be for the Jews to lose the temple, and if it really gets destroyed. So the end of the age brings us to the start of the day of the Lord. And I think I have a chart in there I'll bring up in a little bit. There's these technical terms like the end of the day or end of the age, that day, to the end, time of the end. There's phrases like that are used, and they actually always are used the same way. Scripture is so precise. It's amazing. The language is so clear when you compare one passage with another, and you can see how they're all referring to the same idea. I think that's important. So 4 disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew are there, and we know that from Mark 13. And they ask these 2 questions, and I'm going to divide the 3 as a 2-part. When will this happen? That is, when will the temple be destroyed? And not one stone left upon another. We just said that a moment ago. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Right, is the second question. And they are 2 different times. The first question is 70 AD. The second question is future. Hasn't happened yet, right? Again, Matthew and Mark do not record Jesus' answer to the first question, but Luke does in Luke 21. And we will look at those Luke 21 also to see what he says about that as well. So the answer to the second question begins with the sun, the moon, and the starry events. Because what would be the sign of your coming? I'm going to briefly bring us down to verse 29 and 30 here, just to show you that they ask a question, Jesus answers that question. Right? And that's important to get that Jesus hears this question from the disciples and he answers it. Because if you're, for example, a pre-tribber and you get down to where he answers that question, they're saying that's not the rapture. They're saying, no, that's where Jesus comes at the end of the 70th week. And we're going, no, this is the coming of Jesus. There's only one coming of Jesus. He comes in the clouds, and he's the one involved with the judgments during the time of the great day of the Lord, because it's his day. And then eventually he does the 3 battles and comes down to the ground. So I just want you to see that they ask a question, Jesus answers the question. So when we get to the sign of the Son of Man and his coming, and angels go out and they resurrect from the 4 corners of the earth, he's answering their question. It's the rapture of the church. If you're a pre-tribber, you're going to go to Matthew 24, go, oh no, that's the second coming. It's just so they just take it so loose and go, well, it's the same coming. Because look, there's signs. And we know the rapture is a secret. Well, what makes you say that? As I'm reading the text, if Jesus really answers their question and he describes the sign of the Son of Man and the resurrection that goes on with the angels going out to the 4 corners of the earth and bringing all the elect to them, how do you take, that's another resurrection later on. No, that is the rapture. Jesus answers the question in the text. And it is the rapture of the church, not the so-called second question. So, again, the answer to the second question, the sign, what is your sign at the end of the age? The answer to the second question begins with the sun, moon, and stars event in verse 29. It's a sign that, a sign is something you see. A sign isn't a hidden sign. It's a sign that you don't see. Well, then it's not much of a sign. I mean, right, you get the picture. A sign has to be visible to you. So this is that chart, and I could print this out. Maybe this is I'm not going to go into all the verses, the detail, but I want you to see, when it talks about the idea of the time of the end, he's referring specifically to the 70th week of Daniel, specifically the time of tribulation. And Daniel 8, Daniel 11, Daniel 12, all talks about that period of time. When he says knowledge shall increase, he's talking about during the 70th week of Daniel, as that time begins. And then he said, refers to the idea of the end of the age. Of course, the rapture takes place, and then we go up. Right? We're here during the time of the end, but we are not here at the end of the age. The end of the age is for us. The end of the age is when the rapture takes place, and then the persecution, I should say, and the wrath of God is poured out, is a better way of putting it, which is the second half of the week. It includes the idea of the kingdom and all that. So Daniel 12, Matthew 13, and Matthew 24, Matthew 20. Remember when Jesus says, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, right? He's going to be with us up to the end of the age. So we're not here during the end of the age. We're up to it. We're taken up, and then the wrath of God is poured out. The day of the Lord begins. See, the language is so precise when you go through the Word of God. It's amazing. So anytime you see the end of the age, it's referring to the day of the Lord, but we go up, right, up to that point, up to the day, end of the age, but we're not in that period of time. And then there's this other big, long period of time. This is the period called this age. And this age there's a whole bunch of verses that talk about it. Matthew, Luke, 1 Corinthians, Paul does in Galatians and Ephesians, talking about this age, which is also called this present evil age. We're living in a present evil age right now. This age is the time of it really refers to everything from the Old Testament to New Testament. In the future, the whole period is an evil age until it's all set right when Jesus starts his kingdom and all goes with it. And then lastly, we see the phrase age to come. It's referring to after, the idea of the kingdom is over. And there's going to be an age to come. There's going to be a new heaven and a new world. This one, you see these words, end of the age, time of the end, this age, and age to come. I know it seems like a nerdy thing to take the time to study that, and maybe it is, but guess what? When you do it, you find out, man, the Word of God is so precise. The language is so incredibly accurate and consistent in the way it uses it. Anyway, to me, this is it blows me away, kind of reality, how the language is so good that way. Okay, so I'm going to build up to a chart here, and I don't like to read a whole lot, but let me just read a little bit because I think this is important. When we talk about the book of Matthew, there are, if just in general, we talk to different people, they say, well, the book of Matthew is about Jesus comes as a king. Okay, that is a theme. That's important. When you look at the chronology or the genealogy of Jesus, for example, it is emphasizing the fact that he's the king and all that. But what they would use that to mean is that, so Matthew 24 talks in language that sounds like saints going through persecution. Well, obviously that can't be us because we know we're taken up beforehand as the pre-trib position. It's that presupposition that's the problem, that they're taken up beforehand. They're going to say Matthew is about Israel and not for the church. The problem is Mark and Luke talk about the same things in the same context. I mean, it's the same teaching from Jesus, the Olivet Discourse, where he's teaching them about these very things that are going to happen in the future. And it's kind of hard to say that Luke, as a Gentile, and Mark, which is written in the context of a Roman who wants to understand the movement of Jesus, to try to say that's all Jewish. It isn't at all. But they still say the same thing. They have to deny the church will see any persecution because the system tells them we're taken up beforehand, even though they can't demonstrate that. They have to do it by telling you, well, Matthew doesn't count. What? I mean, they don't say it quite so boldly, but we'll get into the details of how they try to ignore everything we're about to look at. Okay, so the pre-tribulational rapture position considers Matthew 24 to refer to future Jews and maybe new believers living during Daniel's 70th week. It can't be the church, so anything that's going on there, maybe some new people come to believe, or at least it refers to just to Jews and maybe new believers. That's all they say. It can't be the church. Again, the presupposition is they go up, we go up first. So obviously we can't be around, is their view. So they do not understand this chapter to have application for the church age believers. They just don't. When they go through Matthew 24, oh, that's in the future, that's not for us. That's just the typical answer. I mean, I know I used to have to try to put forth that idea when I was a pre-tribber. They would point to words such as Judea in verse 16, and the Sabbath is used in verse 20 as, distinctively Jewish terms and not Christian terms. Okay, that's fine. This may be a popular position, but it lacks expository or contextual consistency. Meaning, you're picking isolated little words, but when you look at the rest of the words, it's going to contradict that notion. So the point of this passage, it is important, is summed up in the idea of urgency. There's an urgency when you get to verse 15 in particular. There's an urgency because those in Jerusalem have a problem because the Antichrist shows up there in verse 15. Whatever the Antichrist is about to do, verse 15, will happen very quickly. This is especially true if you live in close proximity to the events of Jerusalem. I mean, if you know an event's going to take place in Washington, D.C., you're going to be telling everybody in that region, around the Beltway or in Baltimore, whatever, to get out of there. They're going to tell those guys, get out of there because that's where the big event's going to happen. You want to be away from there right away. This is what's happening in Jerusalem. In the temple in particular, initially, is bad things going to happen with the Antichrist. So he's telling those people especially, get out of there very quickly. And when he goes into the details, I think it's going to be pretty obvious. This is especially true if you live in close proximity to the event in Jerusalem. The temple is where the place where the event will take place. It's in Judea. That's why he says Judea. And they hold to the Sabbath. So, of course, he said, pray that you don't have to travel on the Sabbath. We'll get there. So the mention of the Sabbath is used for the same reason as pregnant women. Oh, wait a minute. Because, see, they would say, look, the idea of Judea and Sabbath, see, it tells you the whole thing is all about Israel, right? Because it says Judea and it says Sabbath. Wait a minute now. Jesus also mentions the mention of Sabbath is used for the same reason. What about for those who are women who are pregnant? Well, oh, wait a minute. Only Jews have women who are pregnant? I mean, you get the idea. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. He's not narrowing it to only Jews because women in our country get pregnant too. It's a very real thing. And they nurse babies, and those are nursing babies. It's ridiculous. But they say, well, just because the word Judea and Sabbath is used, we can kind of ignore that whole chapter and move on. And literally, that is what has to happen as a pre-tribber. They have a system, they teach the system, and the system always starts out with the presupposition, we go up, and then the 70th week of Daniel begins. These things, the Sabbath, or pregnant women, nursing babies, and winter, only Jews have winter. I'm being sarcastic for a reason, because the precision is unbelievable. It makes no sense at all. Obviously, we all have winter. These slow you down. That's the reason he names all these things. There's an urgency. Get out of there. Bad things are about to happen. If you're in that area, you're about to get killed. You're going to want to leave. So these things slow you down. The following chart I'll show you will show why Matthew 24 is applicable for the future church. Matthew 24 is for the church, age believers. The flow of the text is that Jesus is talking to his disciples concerning future events. I mean, it's so logical, but they say, well, he's talking to his disciples, and they would argue, well, weren't they Jews? Yeah, all the disciples were Jews. So, see, he's talking to Jews. Wait a minute, as you take that approach, you're going to be throwing half the Gospels away. I mean, you're going to see how absurd that is. I mean, this is the kind of logic they have to use to dismiss it, because it's clear. Jesus talking to his disciples who are the apostles of the church, and he's preparing them for things that's going to happen in the future. But if you're a pre-tribber, he's talking to these Jews who are the disciples who move on, because they can't really explain it very well. They really can't. It's very difficult for them. So I have 6 things here as to why Matthew 24, or much of the other Bible of Matthew, is really for the church. It's preparing for the church. And so, number 1, Jesus answers questions from his disciples. First of all, the disciples are the who. Who are the disciples? Well, they are the followers of Jesus who become again, I mentioned earlier, they become the apostles, do they not, of the church, the foundation for the church, right? So, and I put all this whole idea is try to show really the absurdity of pre-trib. I gotta just beat up on it for a little bit, because I had a lot of good friends at Pre-Trib, and they're just closed-minded. Nope, had nothing to do with us. They would ignore all this text. So the Pre-Trib position applies Matthew 24 to tribulation saints, or to new believers, they were called. So a tribulation saint is not the church, because church goes up, church is done with their view that when the rapture takes place, there's nothing that's church going forward. It's all now Jewish again. So if anybody's saved in the Daniel 70th week, that last 7-year period, then they were no longer church. They are now new believers, or tribulation saints is what they were called. So they create a new category. Or they just simply say they're now Jewish believers. Why? Because God's only dealing with one group at a time. He's done with the church. The rapture takes place. Now they're in Daniel's 70th week. Now if they come to faith in Jesus, now they're Jews. Even though they're Gentiles, they're now Jews. They have to be, because God only deals with one group at a time. I'm just trying to show the absurdity as we go through this, how their position, if you really have a conversation with them, you're going to hear them use buzz phrase words like I'm exactly saying right now that won't make sense. So they're going to call these people, these saints that are going to go through a tribulation time, Matthew 24, as simply new Jewish believers during Daniel's 70th week. However, Jesus knows these disciples become apostles before the events. I think it's pretty obvious. He knows he's talking to his disciples who are the foundation for the church. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous the way they have to divide it out. Jesus refers to church-age saints in the future. When he's talking to his disciples, he's talking to them as knowing that very soon, on the day of Pentecost, 50 days later after Jesus is crucified, what's going to happen is the day of Pentecost and the birth of the church. So he's not talking about Jews in the future, he's talking to Christians. Mark, who's a Gentile, gives the same account. I mean, this is funny. It's easy when you go to Matthew. It's easy for them to say, "Well, see, that's Matthew. Well, Matthew's to the Jews." Well, that's kind of interesting. But so you're saying everything Matthew says is, well, no, just the things about the future. Oh, only the things about the future are concerning Jews, and everything else does apply to the church. Oh. How do you hermeneutically get to that point? There's no good logic to it other than there's a system that tells them the rapture has to happen first. And when you have that in mind, that's how you can dismiss whole sections of Scripture like Matthew 24. Pretty amazing. So should we consider Mark 13:14 when viewing the same event, future event, as referring to Jewish believers only? I mean, it makes no sense when you can see the same thing, the same account in Matthew 24 is it also in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. So they say the same things about the same persecution is going to go on, but only in Matthew can you dismiss it. And what we like about Matthew is it does such a great job of giving you the details of the future, but they can easily dismiss the entire chapter. But Mark and Luke do the same thing. Well, we don't talk about that. So sometimes with certain groups, you can talk to them from Luke's account, and it blows them away. They don't have the Matthew, well, it's for Jews, because it's the same thing. I'm just trying to show, theologically, their position is untenable, very much so. So Matthew is the only gospel that actually mentions the word church, or ecclesia. Matthew is the only one. But this is before Matthew 24. Jesus is talking about, I will build my church, but when you get to 24, well, he's not talking to the church there. It's really bizarre kind of logic. When you just talk to them logically, they go, well, yeah, but that's just the way it is. That's a really bad reason to believe something like that. It's just the way it is. It's not. Right? Jesus said, I will build my church, right? And in Matthew 16, talking about Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, upon that, I will build my church. Upon your confession of faith and your statement of faith and belief that I am the Messiah, I will build my church. That chapter 16 is before 24. I just want you to see, this is ridiculous to say Matthew 24 is not for the church. It's pretty obvious. Jesus is already talking about the church. It is Matthew that we learn about how to properly handle church discipline. How do you know about church discipline? Well, it's only in one gospel. It's in Matthew 18. Luke doesn't deal with it. Mark doesn't deal with it. Only in Matthew 18 you deal with the idea of church discipline. If you have a problem with someone, you go to that person individually, and if they still don't want to agree and they want to continue in their sin, then you bring another one with you. If they continue in that way, then eventually you bring them before the church. A very serious thing. That's all in Matthew. And 18 is before 24. I'm just being sarcastic to kind of show the absurdity of the pre-trib idea that, I can dismiss it because that's for the Jew. It's ridiculous. So, and there, the Lord, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper in all four of the Gospels, right? Well, actually, the Lord's Supper isn't really shown the same way as it is in John. In fact, when you get to John, he gets up to that point and talks about the foot washing and all that, and then he ends up stopping. But the point is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about the institution of the Lord's Supper, which is a church thing. It's pretty obvious that it should be considered a church book. Otherwise, we say, well, we can't read Matthew because it may be for the church. It's not for the church. It's absurd. Matthew gives us the Great Commission, just like all the others, and all this is before Pentecost. Jesus is speaking about the church before the church was born, right? Born on 50 days later on the day of Pentecost. So Matthew's the only one that really mentions the idea of the church is pretty important because he's very focused on what's going to happen. He knows he's going to die on the cross and all that, and he knows the church is going to begin on the day of Pentecost. Jesus knows all that, so everything he's teaching his disciples is for the church. I'm hoping I'm emphasizing that point enough, right? Number 4, Matthew tells us not to set dates for the rapture. This is quite interesting. Well, as we go on in the text, it's going to be more embarrassing when you're talking to a pre-tribber because they get that. Yeah, he tells us not to try to predict dates for the rapture. No man knows the day nor the hour, right? Matthew 24 and Mark 13 both say that. We don't know the day nor the hour. And the event itself is Matthew 24, 29, verses 29 and 30, 31, that little section. When they see the sign of the Son of Man, and Jesus is in the clouds, and the angels go out and collect from the four winds, everybody's all resurrected. And then he goes on and gives these 7 examples. 7 examples. Perfect. And he said, listen, no man knows the day nor the hour. He's talking about the rapture. So if you're a pre-tribber, you go through the text and you say, no, this is for the church. And then you see this event, that refers to verse 30. Well, that's way out there when Jesus comes at the end of the week. But then he goes on to give illustrations about that big event where he just comes. And they just called it the second coming, but he's illustrating the rapture. And you go, wait a minute, but... So somehow he switched gears and didn't tell you. There's nothing in the text that shifts gears at all. He's building and building and building. So Matthew 24 is all about the rapture. Every bit of it is building up to the big event. And then all those examples, it's going to be like the time of Noah and all that. All that is examples of the rapture, not the so-called second coming. I say so-called because there is only one second coming. When Jesus does come there for us. So number 5, believers will be hated for my name's sake. Well, then they have to say, then they have to just be Jewish new believers who they may not be Jews, but they're now Jewish because they can't be the church because they divide the church up. They say we're taking out now from this time forward after the so-called rapture. At that point, then they can only be Jews. Terrible division. I just want you to see it. It's absurd. So believers are going to be, Jews are not persecuted for Jesus' name's sake. They're persecuted for their own sake, because they're Jews. And people hate them because of it. Anti-Semitism and all that. We're the ones who, because of Jesus' name, are persecuted. And the last one, Matthew speaks of the elect. Right? The word elect is never used in the New Testament to refer to Jews. Ever. And you go through the chart and you look at all the uses of the word elect, and you're not going to find the word elect in the Hebrew is used 3 times for the Jews, but when it comes down to, I bet it's going to go there. Oh, good. But when it comes down to, it goes back to, it moved on, didn't it? All right. But the idea is the elect. He goes out and he collects the elect from the 4 winds. He describes them as going through all over the globe, and they are resurrected, and it's the elect that are brought up. The elect is always referring to church-age believers. The period called the Great Tribulation is cut short, remember, and you'll see that when we get to verse 22, for the sake of the elect. The part that's called Great Tribulation, it's only going to last so long, and is for the sake of the elect, us believers, it's going to be cut short because we go up to be with Christ. And that's what he's saying. It's not referring to unbelieving Jews whatsoever. So let me end it there. This is really the outline for the... Oh, actually, I gave you the handout of that. So this is the outline for Matthew. Matthew's not hard. It can be the first time you read it through, because then if you try to outline it yourself, you'll probably come up with something different at first. I have many times in the past. But as time goes on, it became more obvious that it's an easy outline. So I just want you to see this as a handout, and we'll close there. And I end up talking a lot more than I wanted to. My bad. So anyway, you're going to see it's always going to come at the end of the age. Right? And remember that other chart, these phrases are very precise. The end of the age begins at the beginning of the week, the last 7-year period. It's going to end at the end of the trib before the day of the Lord, which means we go up. So he's going to be covering that whole period of time, the 70th week of Daniel, especially the second half. And he's going to deal with the beginning of sorrows and the tribulation by the Antichrist. He's going to deal with that. And then Jesus is going to expand on that. And that's an exposition of what between verses 8 through 14. He's going to expand on that dramatically, give you more details about it, but it's the same period. And you'll see why when you get into the text, he describes the end. The end is when Jesus comes. We make it to the end of the age, and that's the period. It gets kind of confusing for people when they say, well, how come he talks about the end in verse 14? He's got all these other verses. We'll make sense of it. It's not hard. He talks about us going up. And he'll particularly talk about that when you get to verse 30. And then 29 through 31, you got all these different, the sign of the Son of Man, the coming of Jesus, the sun, moon, and star, and all that stuff. And then he gives all these illustrations. The parable of the fig tree, no one knows the day nor the hour, one taken, one left. You've all heard these, master of the house and the thief, and the faithful and the evil servants. And then you get into chapter 25, he continues on with other things. But the big event is Jesus coming for the rapture of the church, and he illustrates it. And these illustrations, even pre-tribbers know this is referring to the rapture, but somehow they can't be tied to the event. That's what it comes down to. The event is when he comes and rescues us. The illustrations illustrate that event. And I think that's pretty obvious if you're a pre-tribber that it won't make any sense hermeneutically, and certainly not from the context. Because when you go through the text, it's clear that it has to apply to somebody, and they just say, well, it does apply. It applies to future Jews or new believers. It can't be us. All right, well, very good. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. We want to slowly go through your word and analyze it and understand it to such a degree that we'll be able to explain it to somebody, have questions about the future, what's going to happen, knowing that you have it all under control and in your plan. Father, we just thank you for the realization of that. Help us as we go from this place to look for opportunities to serve you now. In Jesus' name, amen.